self-produce video from an entity and present it, but we do that now because sometimes that's the only access we have to somebody. One example of that, I was thinking how the media assists by letting the White House and corporations set their agenda for the day's news with press releases and telling them what the story is, rather than going off script and deciding what the story is. And when I was at the University of Florida learning how to cover news and what our job was, one of the first things I was taught, when you get a press release, you get a ton of those every day, that's not the news. That's a story that somebody wants you to tell. That's information an interest wants you to have. But your job is to look past the four corners of the press release and find the truth, if it's something newsworthy. So there are very few instances in which you would report something directly off a press release. It happens all the time now. I mean, it's just an easy way to turn something quickly that pleases whatever interest that you're trying to advance. And that's something that would never have been done a few years ago. Another way we let them, as I say, call the shots on the agenda, or another example of this is when I was at CBS the last couple of years, we were doing a story on the idea that the TSA was planning to let pocket knives, small pocket knives, back on planes. And this was the subject of a lot of discussion. I was assigned to do a story, and when we needed the interview with the head of the TSA, they didn't want to do one. And I might add, we also asked for interviews from Democrats and Republicans on relevant committees on Capitol Hill. They didn't want to do interviews. And I think that's, to me as a press person, kind of outrageous that when you ask for public representatives who are key to these decisions for simple interviews for their opinions, they act like you're barking up the wrong tree, like, why are you coming to me? If they don't set the agenda and want to talk about something, they simply, in many cases, just say no. A week later, we get a call. TSA wants to talk now. A week later, they have something that they want to say about this. Well, my view is, we did the story last week, and unless you have news, something completely different than what we know, you're out of luck today. We don't have this on our agenda for what we think the public needs to know today. But instead, all of the networks, we rushed our cameras to the time and place they described for what we call round-robin interviews, where we all, one at a time, conduct the same interview with the same official who gives roughly the same information and no real news, and we put it on the air that night, all of us together. In a Machiavellian way, and I would say that history dictates you do think a little bit like this and that you're not wrong in doing so, when they create news on a given day, when they call you to bring your cameras to something all of a sudden for news that night, sometimes I think it's also a dual purpose to knock another story off the air. Suddenly there's no time in your 22 minutes of news that you have to do the critical story that you were working on or to do another story that they may want to bury. So it serves a dual purpose. My view, I think when they try to dictate the terms of news coverage, is we should just say, we're not going to get a camera to you today if you have nothing particularly newsworthy to announce. We needed you to talk last week, and we would have pressed them the week before as a public official to answer questions. But too often, I think that's not done. A lot of people ask me, is the current administration worse on all of these issues? Is it worse on transparency? Is it worse on free speech, freedom of the press? And I would say I've only covered a couple of administrations, but reporters who have covered more than I and longer than I think are in general agreement. It's a consensus, it's not just an opinion. And they say this is the worst administration for transparency that they've ever covered. The press has said so in letters that it's written to the White House. More than 50 organizations have signed on to various letters objecting to certain policies. White House photographers have sent letters objecting to policies. One photographer likened some of the policies of this White House to the Soviet news agency TASS. That's how bad it is. There's been reporters from the New York Times, the Washington Post, LA Times, Wall Street Journal, all the networks, they've all signed on to these objections. But my concern is we're not covering it like the news story that it is. So we're making these internal objections almost as if there's a family squabble, but we're not really addressing it in the big sense. And we have allowed this balance to get out of whack. I think we can expect an administration and we can expect federal officials to want to grasp power. For whatever reason, there's that tendency for the federal bureaucracy to want to grow. and to want to covet information and even keep us from the information that we own. But that's the job of the press. That's where we come in. We're supposed to make sure that balance doesn't get out of whack. And too often we haven't done a good job. Give you a couple of quick more examples of things that I think have crossed the line with the government's tack toward journalists and trying to control what we do. As many of you know, I covered Fast and Furious, and there are many examples as I covered that of things that I thought happened that were not appropriate on the government's part. But one of them was there was going to be a background briefing offered at the Department of Justice. And as the reporter at CBS covering Fast and Furious, and the one who really knew by far the most about it, I headed over when I heard about it to cover the background briefing. But no sooner did I call, I had left a message telling the press officer, Tracy Sheryl, that I was coming over. Did she call back and leave a message that I checked a few minutes later that said, don't bother to come here, we're not going to clear you in the building. And I called her back and said, why not? She said, you don't have a Justice Department pass. Well, I'm a press pass reporter who on any other day can get into the Justice Department. I'm surely not a terrorist risk. I had credentials that allow me to walk up to the President of the United States. I've had FBI background checks. But they're using the excuse of a security issue. In other words, they control security over this public federal building. They're using that to limit who covers them in the press. It's wholly inappropriate. And it's the first time I encountered anything like that. They were not going to let me in the building. They wanted to be covered by the regular reporters who actually have offices inside the Justice Department, the beat reporters. And we didn't have anybody there that day. Networks don't necessarily have a reporter every day. But that was they were dictating the terms of who could cover them and how. And as I turned around and went back to the office, and I raised the issue with my bureau chief, because I really felt we should have been much stronger pushing back about these things, and also that if all the networks would get together and all the press, and we would all push back, they wouldn't be able to do this. So my bureau chief did agree that this was a travesty and something that shouldn't happen, but his view was